The last thing my husband ever said to me was, "There's nothing to worry about. I've taken care of everything." I thought he meant the bills. I thought he meant the insurance. I thought he was being kind. 3 weeks after he was buried, I sat in a bank I'd never visited, in a part of town he told me he never went to. And a manager handed me documents showing 6 accounts, exposed trusts, and a net worth that would have changed every single day of my life if I had known. My hands were shaking, but my voice was steady when I said, "I need to see every transaction from the last 5 years." Because somewhere in those numbers was the truth about who my husband really was and who helped him hide it from me. Let me back up. The funeral was on a Tuesday. It rained. I wore a black dress I'd owned for 12 years because it was the only one I had. Our son David stood on my left. His wife Karen stood on his right, one hand on his shoulder, the other scrolling quietly through her phone. I remember thinking that was rude, but I didn't say anything. I never said anything. The house was full of people afterward. Casseroles and handshakes and voices that blurred together into one long hum of sympathy. By evening, everyone was gone, and I sat alone at the kitchen table with a pile of mail I'd been avoiding for weeks. Overdue notices. Final warnings. A mortgage statement with red letters across the top. I called the credit card company first. I explained that my husband had passed and I needed to understand what we owed. The woman on the phone was kind but firm. There were 3 cards I didn't know existed. 2 were maxed out. I hung up and stared at the wall for 20 minutes. Then I opened the next envelope. And the next. By midnight, I had a number in my head that made my chest hurt. We were buried. Not just in grief. In debt. Real, suffocating, how am I going to eat next month's debt? I didn't sleep that night. I sat in his office and looked at the desk he'd locked me out of for the last 2 years of his life, and I thought, what did you do to us? 3 weeks later, the phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway. A woman's voice, calm and professional. "Mrs. Dalton, this is Angela Reese from First Heritage Bank. I'm calling regarding the accounts associated with your late husband's estate. We'd like to schedule a time to meet with you." I told her there must be a mistake. We banked at the credit union on 5th Street. We had a checking account and maybe $400 in savings on a good month. She paused. Then she said, "Mrs. Dalton, you're listed as the surviving spouse on several accounts here. We do need to meet with you. It's important." I drove to the address she gave me. It was across town, past the shopping plaza my husband used to say was too expensive to even walk through. The bank was new, sleek, the kind of place I would never have gone into on my own. I gave my name at the desk, and a man in a gray suit led me into a private office. He offered me water. I said no. He slid a folder across the desk and opened it carefully, like he was showing me something fragile. "Mrs. Dalton, I want to walk you through what we have on file." I nodded. He turned the first page. It was an account summary. 6 accounts, all in my husband's name. Some with my name listed underneath as beneficiary. Numbers I didn't understand at first because they had too many commas. He turned another page. Trust documents. Investment portfolios. A total at the bottom of the 3rd page that made my stomach drop. $1.4 million. I stared at that number until it stopped looking like words. Then I looked up at him and said, "Who else has accessed these accounts?" He hesitated. "There have been recent inquiries. I can show you the authorization forms if you'd like." He pulled another paper from the folder. At the top was a signature I recognized immediately. Neat, curled, confident. Karen's. If you're listening to this and you've ever trusted someone completely, the kind of trust where you don't even think to ask questions, then you already understand how I felt sitting in that bank. I'm going to tell you everything. And I need you to hear all of it before you judge anyone, including me. Because the full truth took me weeks to uncover, and it changed every relationship in my life. If you're still with me, I'd be grateful if you take a second and hit that like button. And if this story sounds even a little bit familiar, leave me a comment and tell me where you're listening from. It helps more than you know. Now let me tell you who I was before all of this, so you understand why it hurt the way it did. My name is Catherine Dalton. I'm 62 years old. I worked in a cafeteria at Monroe Elementary for 23 years until my knees gave out and I took early retirement. I'm not flashy. I'm not the kind of woman people notice in a room. I keep a clean house. I remember birthdays. I've never owned anything designer in my life, and I never wanted to. I married my husband, Richard, when I was 24. He was kind. He was steady. He worked in logistics and he made decent money, or so I thought. Early on, he asked if he could handle the finances. He said it would be simpler that way, less stressful for me. I said yes. I didn't think twice about it. That's what you did. You trusted your husband. You built a life together and you didn't check the statements because checking meant you didn't believe him. We had 2 kids. David, our son, and Lisa, our daughter. I stayed home with them when they were small, then went back to work part-time when they started school. Richard handled everything else. The mortgage, the bills, the taxes, the retirement accounts I assumed we didn't have. I wore the same winter coat for 9 years. I drove a car with a broken passenger window for 2 years because Richard said we couldn't afford to fix it yet. I skipped dental cleaning so he could keep his. I made grocery lists on the back of old envelopes, and I knew exactly how to stretch $40 into 7 dinners. I never complained. I didn't think I had a reason to. I thought we were struggling together. We weren't. I think about all the little moments now, the ones that didn't make sense at the time, but I smoothed over because I didn't want to seem paranoid. 25 years into our marriage, I asked Richard if we could take a weekend trip. Nothing big. Maybe a bed and breakfast 2 hours away. Something to celebrate. He looked pained. He said, maybe next year when things settle down. I said okay. I always said okay. Next year never came. When David needed help with a down payment on his first house, I gave him $3,000 from a savings account I'd kept separate. Money I'd saved from birthday checks and Christmas gifts over the years. Richard said we didn't have anything to spare from the household funds, so I gave what I had. I thought that was all there was. I thought I was helping my son start his life the only way I could. It didn't occur to me that we had more. It didn't occur to me that I was being lied to in my own kitchen. Richard wasn't cruel. That's the part that makes it harder. He thanked me for dinner. He held my hand at church. He told me I was the backbone of the family, and I believed him. I built my identity around being that person, the one who made things work, the one who sacrificed quietly and never made it about herself. I wore that like a badge. I didn't know I was being managed. There were signs, small things I noticed but explained away because the alternative was too painful. About 2 years before Richard died, he started getting mail at a P.O. box I didn't know he had. I found the key once in his jacket pocket when I was doing laundry. I asked him about it. He said it was for work, something about client invoices that needed to be kept separate. I didn't ask again. He started taking phone calls in the garage. He'd come back in and I'd say, "Everything okay?" And he'd smile and say, "Nothing important." He made trips on Saturday mornings. Errands, he called them. But he never came back with groceries. He never came back with anything I could see. I asked once where he went, and he said he just liked to drive and think. I thought it was sweet. I thought he needed space. In the last 2 years of his life, Richard became protective of his office. He'd always had a desk in the spare bedroom, but suddenly there was a lock on the drawer. He started using a laptop I never saw him open around me. If I came into the room, he'd close it. Not fast. Not suspicious. Just casual. Like it was nothing. And I told myself it was nothing. He also started keeping his phone face down. He changed the password. When I asked why, he said he'd been getting spam calls and didn't want me to accidentally answer one. It sounded reasonable. Everything he said sounded reasonable. But the strangest part, the part one didn't piece together until much later, was Karen. My daughter-in-law started visiting more often. At first, I thought it was nice. She'd come by on weekday afternoons and say she was in the neighborhood. But she didn't come to see me. She came to see Richard. They'd go into his office and close the door. I'd hear their voices, low and steady, but I couldn't make out the words. Once I knocked and brought them tea. They both looked up like I'd interrupted something important. Karen smiled and said, "Thanks, Mom." Richard didn't say anything. When I asked him later what they'd been talking about, he said, "Just boring paperwork stuff. Nothing you'd want to deal with." I believed him. I always believed him. After Richard died, things moved faster than I could keep up with. David was devastated. I expected that. He barely spoke at the funeral. But in the days after, he became distant in a way that felt wrong. Karen, on the other hand, became sharp. Focused. She started going through Richard's office before I'd even finished sorting through his clothes. I came home from the grocery store one afternoon and found her in there with boxes, pulling files out of the cabinet. I stood in the doorway and said, "What are you doing?" She looked up and smiled. "Just helping you get organized, Mom. You shouldn't have to stress about all this paperwork." I didn't know what to say. I felt like I should thank her. So I did. She told me not to worry about the files. She said most of it was junk, old tax returns and receipts that didn't matter anymore. She carried 3 boxes out to her car that day. I asked what was in them. She said, "Nothing you'd want to keep." I watched her load them into her trunk and I felt something twist in my chest. Something I didn't have a name for yet. It wasn't quite suspicion. It was more like displacement. Like I was being moved out of my own life and I was supposed to be grateful for it. A week later, David came over and sat me down at the kitchen table. He looked tired. He said, "Mom, we need to talk about the house." I asked what he meant. He said Karen had been looking into the finances and it seemed like the mortgage was underwater. He said I might need to sell. He said it gently, like he was trying not to scare me, but the words hit like a fist. I asked if he was sure. He nodded. He said Karen had spoken to someone who knew about these things. I didn't ask who. I just sat there and nodded and said I'd think about it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the boxes Karen had taken. I kept thinking about the office door closing. I went into Richard's desk and opened the drawer where he used to keep a folder labeled personal. It had been there the week before. I'd seen it when I was looking for the insurance paperwork. Now it was gone. That's when the bank called. 3 weeks after the funeral. Angela Reese. First Heritage Bank. I drove across town in my 14-year-old car with the broken window, and I sat in that office, and I learned that my entire marriage had been a lie. Not the love. Maybe not even the intention. But the reality. The shape of the life I thought I was living. 6 accounts. 2 trusts. Investment portfolios I didn't know existed. A net worth that would have meant I never had to choose between fixing my teeth and fixing the car. That would have meant my son didn't need my $3,000. That would have meant I could have taken the weekend trip. I could have bought a coat that fit. I could have lived differently. And someone kept that from me. Someone chose every single day to let me live small. The manager, his name was Mr. Brennan, walked me through the documents slowly. He showed me the account activity. Regular deposits. Dividends. Transfers. I didn't understand all of it, but I understood enough. I asked again about the authorization forms. He pulled them out. There were 3. All recent. All dated within the last 2 months. All signed by Karen. I looked at her name on that paper and something inside me went very still. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I said, I need copies of everything. Every account. Every transaction from the last 5 years. Mr. Brennan nodded. He said it would take a few days to compile. I said I'd wait. I went home and I made myself tea. I sat at the kitchen table with my purse in my lap and the bank documents folded inside, and I didn't move for an hour. I just thought. I thought about Karen's smile when she took the boxes. I thought about David saying the mortgage was underwater when clearly, we had more money than I'd seen in my entire life. I thought about Richard's office. The lock. The laptop. The P.O. box. The Saturday errands. I thought about the phrase he used to use. I've taken care of everything. And I realized what he meant. He'd taken care of everything so I wouldn't have to see it. He'd taken care of everything so I'd stay exactly where I was. Small. Grateful. Unaware. Over the next few days, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't call David. I didn't ask Karen to explain. I just watched. I listened. I started paying attention to the way Karen talked about the house. She mentioned the realtor again. She said it would be best to move quickly before the market shifted. She said she'd been working with a financial advisor who could help me figure out what to do next. I asked who the advisor was. She said a friend of Richard's. I nodded. I said that sounded helpful. I didn't tell her I'd already spoken to the bank. I didn't tell her I knew. David called that week and asked how I was doing. I said I was managing. He said Karen had been trying to help me get things in order. He said he hoped I wasn't feeling overwhelmed. I told him I appreciated it. I told him I loved him. I didn't tell him I'd seen his wife's signature on documents giving her access to accounts that didn't belong to her. I didn't tell him I was starting to wonder how much he knew. I went back into Richard's office. I went through everything, slowly this time, carefully. I found a second P.O. box key taped under the desk drawer. I found a receipt from a law office dated 8 months before Richard died. I found a handwritten note in his planner, tucked between 2 pages in March. It said, "Update K on trust timeline. K Karen." I took a picture of it with my phone. I put everything back exactly where I found it. Then I drove to the law office. I didn't call first. I just walked in and asked to speak to someone about my husband's estate. The receptionist asked if I had an appointment. I said no, but I was the widow and I needed to understand what my husband had filed before he passed. She made a call. 10 minutes later, a man came out. His name was Gregory Hale. He was older, maybe 70, with kind eyes and a firm handshake. He brought me into his office and closed the door. I showed him my ID, my marriage certificate, and the bank documents. I said, "My husband came to see you 8 months ago. I need to know what he was planning." Mr. Hale looked at the documents. He looked at me. Then he opened a file cabinet and pulled out a folder. He said, "Mrs. Dalton, your husband had come to me. He wanted to restructure his estate. He was concerned about tax implications and he wanted to make sure certain assets were protected." I asked what that meant. He said Richard had drafted a revised will. In the original will, everything went to me. In the revised version, the bulk of the estate was redirected into a trust. Karen was named executor. I would receive the house and a small life insurance payout. That was all. I felt the air leave the room. I said, "When was this supposed to take effect?" Mr. Hale paused. Then he said, "It wasn't. Your husband passed before signing the final version. We were scheduled to meet the week after he died." I stared at him. "So it's not legal." He shook his head. "The revised will was never executed. The original will, the one that names you as sole beneficiary, is still the valid document." I sat very still. Then I said, "So everything still belongs to me?" He nodded. "Yes, Mrs. Dalton. Everything." I didn't cry. I didn't feel relief. I felt something colder, clearer. I asked if Karen knew the revised will had never been signed. Mr. Hale said he couldn't be sure, but she had been present at 2 of the meetings. She knew the plan. She knew what Richard intended. Whether she knew it hadn't been finalized, he couldn't say. I thanked him. I asked for a copy of both wills. He printed them and slid them across the desk. I put them in my purse and I drove home. That night I went back to the bank. I asked Mr. Brennan for the full transaction history. He sat with me for 2 hours. I read every line. I saw regular transfers from Richard's hidden accounts into a separate account in Karen's name. Monthly payments, always increasing. I saw payments for a car, credit card bills, a vacation. I remembered that vacation. David and Karen went to Hawaii 2 years ago. They told me they'd been saving for years. I thought it was so responsible of them. I even told Karen I was proud of her for planning ahead. The money came from Richard. I saw the payment for their house. The down payment I thought David needed help with. The $3,000 I gave him from my own savings. He didn't need it. He already had it. Richard had given it to him. And they let me hand over everything I had anyway. That was the detail that broke me. Not the $1 million. Not the secret accounts. Not even the revised will. It was that image. Me, sitting at this same kitchen table, writing a check for $3,000 I'd saved over years from birthday cards and spare grocery money, handing it to my son, watching him hug me and thank me, knowing the whole time he didn't need it. Knowing his father had already given him 10 times that amount. And he took mine anyway. I closed the file. I thanked Mr. Brennan. I went home and I sat in the dark and I let myself feel it. All of it. The anger, the grief, the humiliation, the betrayal. And then I made a plan. Karen called 2 days later. She said she'd arranged for a realtor to come look at the house. She said, "It's the responsible thing to do, Mom. We just want to make sure you're taken care of." I said, "That's very thoughtful of you, Karen." She said she'd been going through more of Richard's financial things and I shouldn't worry. There really wasn't much there. I almost smiled. I said, "I trust you." She said, "I know you do." I could hear the confidence in her voice, the certainty. She thought she'd won. She thought I was still the woman who said okay to everything, who didn't ask questions, who handed over her savings and smiled. David called that evening. He said, "Mom, we just want what's best for you." I said, "I know you do, sweetheart." He said Karen had been working really hard to help me sort everything out. I said, "She's been wonderful." He sounded relieved. I hung up and I called Mr. Hale. I asked him one question. Do I have the legal right to freeze the accounts, revoke Karen's access, and take full control of the estate? He said, "Yes, absolutely." I said, "Then I'd like to do that." He said he'd file the paperwork immediately. I said thank you. Then I called Mr. Brennan and told him the same thing. By Friday, every account was frozen. Karen's authorization was revoked. She no longer had access to a single dollar. Then I set a date. Sunday dinner. I texted David and Karen and said I'd love to have them over. They said I wanted to cook. I said I miss them. Karen replied right away. She said that sounded lovely. David sent a heart emoji. Sunday came. I woke up early. I made a roast, the kind Richard used to love. Mashed potatoes. Green beans. Rolls from scratch. I set the table with the good plates, the ones we only used for holidays. I put flowers in the center. I wanted it to look nice. I wanted it to feel normal. David and Karen arrived at 5. Karen complimented the table. She hugged me and said it smelled amazing. David kissed my cheek. We sat down. We ate. Karen talked about the realtor. She said he'd be available on Tuesday if that worked for me. I said that sounded fine. David mentioned a project at work. I asked questions. I smiled. I poured wine. And when we were finished, I cleared the plates. Then I sat back down and placed a manila envelope on the table. Karen looked at it, then at me. I said, "Before we talk about the house, I want to show you something." I opened the envelope and slid the papers across the table. Account summaries, transaction histories, copies of the authorization forms with Karen's signature, copies of both wills, the original and the one that was never signed. I laid them out slowly, one by one, like I was setting a table. David's face went pale. Karen's mouth opened, but nothing came out. I didn't raise my voice. I looked at both of them and I said, "I know about all of it. Every account, every transfer, every payment. I know about the trust that was never signed. I know the original will is the only one that matters. And I know you both knew." Karen started to say something. I raised one hand. "I'm not finished." I looked at David. "I know your father gave you the down payment for your house. I know you didn't need the $3,000 I gave you. And I know you took it anyway." His eyes filled with tears. I looked at Karen. "I know you've been accessing accounts that don't belong to you. I know you've been planning to sell my house and manage my money like I'm a child who can't be trusted. And I know you thought I'd never find out." Karen stood up. She grabbed her purse. I said, very quietly, "Sit down, Karen. I'm not done." She sat. I folded my hands on the table. "The accounts have been frozen as of Friday. Your access has been revoked. My attorney has everything. The estate belongs to me. The house belongs to me. Every dollar in every account belongs to me. And if you ever try to contact the bank, the lawyer, or any financial institution connected to this estate again, I will hand everything over to a prosecutor and let them decide if what you did was just unethical or actually illegal." David was crying now. Karen's face was red. I stood up. I picked up the plates. I looked at both of them and I said, "There's dessert if you want it." Neither of them moved. I walked into the kitchen and I started running the water. I heard the front door open. I heard it close. I heard their car start. I turned off the water and I stood there, alone in my kitchen, and I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for 30 years. They didn't call for 3 days. Then David came back. Alone. He sat at the kitchen table and he cried. He told me he was sorry. He said Karen told him the trust was what his father wanted. He said he didn't know about all the transfers. He said he thought I knew about the down payment, that his father had told me and I'd wanted to give him the extra money as a gift. I listened. I believed some of it, not all of it. I told him I loved him. I told him I didn't trust him right now, and that was something he would have to earn back. He nodded. He said he understood. He asked if I'd ever forgive him. I said I didn't know yet. Karen and David's marriage started to crack after that. I didn't hear it from them. I heard it from Lisa, my daughter, who hadn't been involved in any of it and was furious when she found out. Lisa became my ally. She called me every other day. She asked what I needed. She listened when I cried. She told me I'd done the right thing. I wasn't sure yet, but I was grateful to hear it. I used some of the money to pay off every debt Richard had left in my name. I paid off the credit cards I didn't know existed. I paid off the mortgage. I bought myself a new winter coat. A good one. Warm. The kind I used to look at in stores and walk past because it wasn't practical. I wore it out of the store. Then I did something I hadn't done in decades. I booked a trip. Just a weekend. A small hotel 2 hours away. The kind of place I'd asked Richard about 20 years ago. I went alone. I sat by the window with a cup of coffee and I watched the rain and I thought about all the years I could have been doing this. All the trips I didn't take. All the coats I didn't buy. All the questions I didn't ask. And for the first time in my entire adult life, I felt like I was living inside my real life. Not the one someone else had decided I should have. Mine. I don't hate Richard. I've thought about that a lot. I think, in some broken way, he believed he was protecting me. He thought keeping me out of the money meant I wouldn't have to worry. But protection that requires deception isn't love. It's control. And control, even the kind that looks like care, is still a cage. The hardest part wasn't the money. It was realizing that the person I trusted most in the world had looked at me every single day and chosen to let me struggle when he didn't have to. He watched me wear the same coat for 9 years. He watched me skip meals. He watched me hand over my savings to our son. And he said nothing. I learned something I wish I'd known 40 years ago. You are allowed to ask questions in your own marriage. You are allowed to see the accounts. You are allowed to know where the money goes and why and what the plan is. Silence is not peace. And trust without transparency is just blindness with a nicer name. Richard told me he'd taken care of everything. He didn't. But I did.